Welcome to your own personal deep dive.
Okay.
Today we're going on a kind of unique journey,
Right.
exploring just a single source, but it's a really fascinating one.
Um,
It unveils a really unsettling account of how Native Americans have been treated throughout U.S. history.
oh, wow.
I mean, you might already be familiar with westward expansion,
Right.
the whole conquest of the West narrative, but
Right.
this source really digs a lot deeper
Oh,
and exposes this shockingly calculated and brutal campaign
wow.
of extermination, segregation, and cultural erasure
Huh?
that's often overlooked in traditional historical accounts.
It's a perspective that challenges our understanding of American history right from the start,
Yeah.
like right from the Declaration of Independence.
Oh, wow.
The source points out that the very document declaring America's freedom labels Native Americans as
Nice.
merciless Indian savages.
That's a pretty jarring way to frame the founding principles of a nation.
It is. It is.
Were Native American raids truly such a threat that they had to be demonized like that in our founding document?
That's a key question the source asks.
Yeah.
While there were definitely conflicts and skirmishes,
Right.
the source argues that this perception of Native Americans as inherently savage
Yeah.
was intentionally exaggerated to justify the taking of their land
Right.
and the policies of displacement and violence that followed.
Wow.
This demonizing language, right, embedded in the nation's DNA, so to speak,
Right.
had a huge impact on how indigenous people were treated for generations to come.
So we're not just talking about isolated incidents here.
No, not at all.
This source suggests a deliberate and systematic effort to eliminate Native Americans from
Yeah.
the very beginning.
Absolutely.
And it gets even more disturbing when the source starts naming names
Yeah.
like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson,
Right, yeah.
as architects of this extermination policy.
It doesn't hold back.
Yeah.
It points to specific policies these founding fathers enacted that led to the forced removal and massacre of so many indigenous people.
Wow, it's a complicated legacy, to say the least.
It is.
These men are lauded for their contributions to democracy and freedom,
Right.
yet their actions towards Native Americans paint a much darker picture.
Exactly that duality.
How do we reconcile those two seemingly contradictory aspects of their legacies?
It's a question that historians and Americans in general are still wrestling with.
Yeah,
The source doesn't offer any easy answers,
right.
but it encourages a more nuanced understanding of these figures.
Okay.
It's not about erasing their accomplishments, but about acknowledging the full scope of their actions,
Yeah.
including those that were undeniably harmful.
And it's not just the big names, right?
Right.
The source also talks about individuals like Colonel John Chivington,
Chivington,
a
yeah?
Methodist pastor who led the brutal Sand Creek Massacre.
Oh, a stark contrast there.
A man of faith orchestrating a horrific act of violence against innocent people.
Really highlights the attitudes of the time.
Yeah.
Chivington's actions weren't universally condemned.
Really?
He even had some supporters who thought the massacre was justified.
Wow.
This speaks volumes about the dehumanizing view of Native Americans held by those in power.
Right, and this wasn't some forgotten footnote in history.
No, not at all.
The source then brings us to the Indian Removal Act of 1830
Okay.
and the devastation it brought upon tribes like the Cherokee,
Right.
who were forced to march thousands of miles westward
The Trail of Tears.
in what became known as the Trail of Tears.
Yeah, a harrowing example of ethnic cleansing.
Wow.
Imagine being ripped from your homeland,
Yeah.
forced to walk hundreds of miles in terrible conditions,
Yeah.
starvation, disease, and death all around you.
Awful.
The source really lays out the horrific details of this forced migration.
And it directly benefited white settlers who wanted that land.
That's the really awful part.
Heartbreaking.
It is.
And the source doesn't stop there.
No.
It goes on to challenge the common perception of Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. Many see him as a hero for ending slavery,
Right.
but this source shows a more complicated legacy
Yeah.
when it comes to his treatment of Native Americans.
It reminds us that he participated in the Black Hawk War early in his career.
Right.
And while he's credited with abolishing slavery,
Yeah.
the forced removal of Native Americans continued under his presidency.
It's not about diminishing his role in ending slavery.
No, of course not.
It's about understanding his actions and their impact on indigenous communities.
Right. A more nuanced view.
It's a lot to take in. Makes you really question how we should view these historical figures with such complex legacies.
History is rarely black and white.
Right.
It's full of contradictions and complexities.
Yeah.
And as this source shows, it's our responsibility to engage with all of it,
Yeah.
even the parts that make us uncomfortable.
Well said.
Thank you.
And the story doesn't end there.
Okay, what else is there?
Next, the source tackles another pivotal event,
Okay,
one that's often romanticized in American culture.
let me guess.
Custer's last stand at the Battle of Little Bighorn.
Custer. Okay. And the source doesn't just stop with the well-known events and figures.
Right.
It goes on to shed light on some lesser-known atrocities,
Okay.
like the brutal treatment of Native Americans in California.
So this is after the U.S. seized the territory from Mexico in 1846.
Yeah, right after.
Okay.
This period is often romanticized, the gold rushes, westward expansion.
Yeah.
But the source paints a much darker picture,
Right.
especially for the indigenous people who are already there.
So what kind of atrocities are we talking about specifically?
Well, the source details a series of massacres
Oh, wow.
carried out under the command of Captain John C. Fremont.
Fremont.
Yeah, including the Sacramento River Massacre,
Okay.
the Clear Lake Massacre,
Wow.
and the Sutter's Buttes Massacre.
So many.
Yeah, these events resulted in the deaths of hundreds, maybe even thousands
Wow.
of Native Californians.
It's hard to believe that such horrific acts could happen and no one was held accountable.
And that's exactly the point the source is making.
Yeah.
These weren't isolated incidents.
Right.
They were part of a systematic campaign to get rid of Native Americans,
Right.
to clear the way for white settlement.
And Fremont, his public image didn't suffer at all.
Nope, not at all.
In fact, he became a senator.
And even a presidential candidate.
Wow, a man responsible for massacring innocent people
Right.
was celebrated as a national hero.
It shows how history is often written, right?
Yeah.
And how some figures, especially when their actions were against marginalized groups,
Yeah.
can just escape accountability.
And Fremont wasn't alone, was he?
No, he wasn't.
Who else?
The source also mentions Captain Edward Kern.
Okay.
He led the Kern and Sutter Massacre in 1847.
How is he remembered?
Well, a river and a county in California still have his name.
Wow, it makes you wonder how many other figures throughout history
Right.
have been honored despite their horrific actions.
It's definitely something to think about.
It is.
And this leads to another shocking thing from the source.
What's that?
The U.S. government actually brought back a medieval practice.
What? Really?
Indentured servitude.
Indentured servitude? I thought that was something from way back in the colonial era.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But in 1850, California passed a law
Okay.
that made it legal to kidnap and force Native Americans into labor.
Seriously.
Yeah.
For white settlers, right?
For white settlers, yeah.
This wasn't some relic of the past.
No.
This was a policy in the mid-19th century.
A deliberate policy.
I don't get how a nation that's supposedly all about freedom and equality could do something so oppressive.
The source argues that this contradiction is at the core of America's story. That the ideals the nation claims to stand for
Right.
were routinely violated when it came to Native Americans and other minorities.
This persistent hypocrisy.
Yeah.
And it seems like this attitude of extermination as the solution
Right.
continued well into the late 1800s.
It did, yeah. The source quotes an editorial
Oh, really?
from the San Francisco Bulletin in 1856.
What did it say?
It said, "Extermination is the quickest and most effective remedy,"
Wow.
when talking about dealing with Native Americans.
That's chillin'.
And this wasn't some obscure publication.
Right.
This was a mainstream newspaper.
So a lot of people saw it.
A lot of people, yeah.
And this wasn't some fringe view either, was it?
No, a lot of people believed that the only way to solve the Indian problem
Right.
was to just eliminate Native Americans completely.
It's scary to think how close it came to doing that.
It is a sobering thought.
Yeah.
And while they may not have gone for outright extermination after a while,
Right.
the policies and actions of the government continue to have a devastating effect on
Mhm.
Native American communities.
Like we talked about earlier, they
Right.
weren't even granted full citizenship until 1924.
That's right, and their right to vote wasn't guaranteed until 1948.
It's just unbelievable how long it took for them to get those basic rights.
And even with those legal victories, the source makes it clear that the struggle isn't over.
Right.
It describes the terrible conditions on many reservations.
Yeah.
High poverty, unemployment, lack of basic
That's
necessities.
heartbreaking to think about.
It is.
That these injustices from so long ago
Right.
still have such a huge impact today.
The past isn't really past, is it?
It feels like it's still very present.
It is. And the source goes on to connect the treatment of Native Americans
Okay.
to other examples of oppression throughout U.S. history.
Like what?
Well, it compares the forced removal of Native Americans
Right?
to the deportation of Mexican Americans
Mhm.
between 1929 and 1940.
Okay.
Both are examples of the government targeting and displacing minority groups.
It's a pretty disturbing pattern.
It is.
This source is really making us see how systemic oppression is in America.
It is, and it's not about placing blame or anything.
Right.
It's about understanding how these systems work and how they continue to hurt certain groups even today.
So where do we go from here?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
The source doesn't give us any easy answers,
Right.
but it does give us some things to think about.
What are some of the key takeaways from this source?
One of the main things is that we can't rely on simplistic narratives of American history.
You mean the whole manifest destiny,
Yeah.
land of the free kind of stuff?
Exactly. We have to acknowledge the dark side of the story,
Right.
the parts that are often ignored.
Right.
The source says that by facing these uncomfortable truths,
Yeah.
we can start to really understand the complexities of the present.
I think it's safe to say that this source is far from the sanitized history we got in textbooks.
Absolutely. And it wants us to think critically about what we've been told
Yeah.
and to look for different perspectives.
Right.
It wants us to listen to those who have been marginalized and silenced.
It's definitely a call to action.
It is.
And it's important to remember that even though the source focuses on Native Americans, it also shows how different forms of oppression are connected.
Exactly. Their struggles are linked to the struggles of other minority groups who've also faced discrimination and injustice throughout U.S. history.
So this isn't just about learning about the past.
No.
It's about using that knowledge to create a better future.
For everyone.
For everyone.
That's where our conversation needs to go next,
okay.
to figure out what we can do to move forward in a meaningful way.
So we've talked about how the U.S. government systematically oppressed Native Americans.
Right.
But this source goes even further.
Yeah.
It compares the Anglo-American approach to westward expansion to the Spanish conquest of the Americas.
Interesting.
And it really makes us rethink our assumptions about history.
Yeah.
How so? It argues that while the Spanish conquest was brutal and exploitative,
Of course.
there was at least an attempt to integrate indigenous populations into their empire.
Okay.
The U.S., on the other hand, went for extermination and segregation.
So it's not saying that the Spanish were the good guys or anything.
No, not at all.
Right.
It's not about romanticizing Spanish colonialism.
Right.
It's about seeing the nuances
Yeah.
and complexities of both historical narratives.
Okay.
The source points out that Spanish law,
Yeah.
while often flawed in practice,
Right.
did offer some protections for indigenous people,
Interesting.
while the U.S. consistently treated them as obstacles to be removed.
Wow, that's a big difference.
Yeah, a stark contrast.
Are there any specific examples the source gives to show this?
Yeah, it talks about mixed marriages, how
Yeah.
they were common in Spanish America from the early days of colonization.
Yeah.
But in the U.S., racial mixing was legally prohibited for centuries.
Huh. A very different approach to race and assimilation.
It's like the Spanish, even with their brutality, they
Right.
at least saw indigenous people as human beings who could be part of their society.
Right.
The U.S. just saw them as a problem to be solved.
An obstacle to erase.
Exactly. And this difference had a huge impact on how each empire developed.
Makes you think how things might have been different.
Yeah, if the U.S. had been more inclusive.
Right.
But this source isn't just about hypotheticals.
Right.
It leads to a pretty harsh conclusion about the U.S.
What's that?
It argues that the U.S. was built on indigenous genocide and black slavery.
Wow. A strong statement.
It is, but it's hard to argue with when you look at the evidence.
Yeah, it's definitely not the patriotic version of history we're used to.
Definitely not, and that's why this source is so important.
Absolutely.
It makes us confront the uncomfortable truths about our past.
It's not about demonizing the U.S. or anything,
right.
or romanticizing the Spanish.
Right.
It's about understanding history's complexities
Yeah.
and seeing how the past still shapes us today.
We've only scratched the surface of this topic.
Yeah, it's a deep dive after all.
Just one perspective, one set of arguments.
A starting point.
Right. And hopefully it'll make people ask more questions.
And want to keep learning.
That's what we hope you'll do. Take what you've learned here.
Yeah.
And keep exploring. Look for different perspectives.
Listen to Native American voices.
Challenge yourself to think critically.
About the stories you hear.
This has definitely been an eye-opener for me.
Yeah, me too.
It's made me question so much of what I thought I knew about American history.
It's powerful stuff.
And it's left me feeling like I need to do more,
Yeah.
to learn more, and to help address the injustices Native Americans still face.
I think that's something we should all feel.
It's not just about the past.
You know.
It's about the present and the future.
Well said.
As we wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
I want to leave you with this.
All right.
How can we as individuals and as a society,
Yeah.
acknowledge and learn from this dark chapter of American history.
Right.
What can we do to support Native American communities today?
These are questions we need to think about carefully.
And keep thinking about.
Yeah, long after this episode ends.
This source has shown us that history isn't just something that happened in the past.
It's still happening.
It shapes our present and our future.
And we have a responsibility to learn from it.
And to create a better future for everyone.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.